sharing. And
Mr. Griffith?
Mhm.
Yeah, sorry, I have a question.
That's okay.
Concerning the paper, you said something about the alignment. Should it be like, is it the headings that should be left aligned? That should be,
Yeah, anything you submit really should always be left aligned.
the whole paper should not be justified. Right?
Yeah, really the whole paper. Some people center the title, but generally the whole paper should be left aligned.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. I did want to mention, because several people pointed out, well, I wanted to mention two things, or three things actually, about the assignment. One is keep in mind that you can always resubmit an assignment. I think you always can. I have D2L set up so that you can do that. So if you turn in the questions and then you decide you don't like your answers, you can always revise them and turn them in again. If you submit a new one, that overrides the last one. So I never download them until after whenever the deadline is. So like tonight or tomorrow morning early, I guess, I would download today's assignment. When we have a paper, you can always resubmit a paper, even if you just have to submit it to me as an attachment. When I download all the papers, I go through my emails and I go through the most recent ones first. So if you do submit a revision of your paper, I do the most recent one and I ignore the earlier ones that you gave me. And then the third thing is, keep in mind, you may or may not have noticed on the first set of questions that I gave you, but you can find most of the answers to these somewhere in either the notes that are posted, or the book that we have, or the description, the Zoom session. So you can go to those recordings. And keep in mind, even though we do go through the notes in class, I don't go over every single part of the note. I emphasize the parts that are more important. So it is good to look at those. There are always some questions that you won't find the answers to in any of those three sources, the book, the notes, or the Zoom. There are some questions that I give you that I think you should be able to figure out by kind of putting 2 and 2 together with what we have discussed or what's in the notes. But I would say probably 70 or 80% of the answers you could find somewhere in one of those three places. So if you haven't been using them, those are definitely good sources to go to find the answers to the questions. But as I said, keep in mind, you won't find everything there because there are some questions that you kind of have to think about and work through them logically. So keep that in mind. We're going to continue talking about invertebrates today. And we're going to talk about the phylum Annelida. And this is segmented worms. And there are 3 main groups. They're actually in separate classes. Remember, classes are the subdivisions of phylums. There are some minor classes, but the 3 biggest classes are a group called the earthworms, which is shown in the middle. Notice this is a typical earthworm like you might find around here, but there are places where earthworms typically get up to about 2 feet long and look more like what you might think of as a small snake, but they're earthworms. There are sandworms. And notice that sandworms have little kind of bristles along the side of their body. These bristles are called setae. And they use these to push through sand, which you might guess is where they live. And then the third group is leeches. Remember, with flatworms and roundworms, we had a lot of parasites. So here, this group also includes some parasites. Now notice there is one significant difference. If we look at flatworms and roundworms, most of the species that are parasitic in those groups are endoparasites. They live inside the host body. Leeches are ectoparasites. They live outside the host body. If we look at the annelids, they're actually very closely related to another group that doesn't appear very similar, mollusks. And we can see this by looking at the larvae of both species. The larvae resemble each other. And one of the patterns that we see in evolution in lots of different groups when we look at them is when two groups diverge, when there's divergent evolution, the pattern of embryology, how the embryo develops from the fertilized egg, starts out pretty similar, and then the pattern of embryology, the pattern of development, gradually gets more and more different. And so we see larvae in the annelids and the mollusks that look kind of similar, but the adults look very different. So they look more similar early in development rather than late when they're mature. And this is a pretty typical pattern. Now, if we look at an earthworm, here's a diagram of an earthworm that's cut open. And what we see when we look at an earthworm or other annelids, other segmented worms, is that typically some of the front segments in the body, and these are shown on the left, have some specialized organs in them. And some of the posterior segments may have some specialized organs. But in between, we have a lot of segments that, notice our diagram shows them as being basically similar. And so this is something that's fairly typical for worms in this group. Every segment isn't different. And this is one of the things, one of the contrasts that we'll make when we look at insects. Insects do have segments, so in that sense, they're similar to annelids, but the segments tend to be more specialized. Now, when we look at these organisms, notice that annelids have a closed circulatory system. This is the first group that we've looked at that has a separate circulatory system from its digestive system. And when we talk about a closed circulatory system, this means that the blood is always contained in a blood vessel. So up front, we have the hearts. And notice in the human embryo, the heart is really just a very thick blood vessel that develops first. And then it folds up in a very complicated pattern to give us all the chambers of the heart. In earthworms, there are actually 5 pairs of hearts, one on the right side, one on the left side, because earthworms, like the roundworms and the flatworms, have bilateral symmetry. So mostly what you see on the right side is what you see on the left side. Then there's one large blood vessel that runs down what in a person would be the back. When an earthworm is crawling, it's actually the top. And there are smaller blood vessels that branch off of this. Now, we will talk about some organisms later that have an open circulatory system, where when the heart pumps the blood goes into a blood vessel, and then it just spurts out over all the organs in the body. But in annelids, the blood is always contained in a blood vessel. Now, in some ways, their blood is similar to people, but there are some significant differences. In people, the molecule that carries the oxygen in our blood has some metal in it. Does anybody know what metal is found in human blood that carries the oxygen, that actually bonds to the oxygen in the red blood cells?
Iron.
Iron, yes, good. And the molecule is called hemoglobin, and heme actually refers to iron. In earthworms, they actually have copper in their blood cells. Now notice one thing both copper and iron have in common, if you've had some chemistry, is when they form ions, they can both form ions that have more than one charge. Copper ions can be either +1 or +2. Iron ions can be either +2 or +3. So that seems to be a crucial property for metal ions that transport oxygen, that they have 2 different oxidation states. So if we look at their digestive system, notice that annelids also have a complete digestive system. They have a mouth, and then they have a one-way flow of food. On our diagram, it would start on the left side and proceed to the right. And then at the very end of the body, there's an anus. The food exits through the anus. Now, the advantage of this is really twofold. One is earthworms can pretty much eat continuously, because while they're pushing food in the mouth, they're pushing whatever they couldn't digest out their anus. We don't really call it feces necessarily in the case of earthworms, keep in mind. So they can eat continuously. Animals like flatworms that only have a single opening in their digestive system, that have an incomplete digestive system, have to stop eating every once in a while in order to eliminate their waste, because there's one opening. So they eat through their pharynx, then they eliminate most of their waste through their pharynx. Now, the other advantage of having a digestive system where the food moves in one direction, it allows for more specialized organs. So earthworms do have a pharynx, and this pharynx is a muscular organ they use to kind of suck their food into the body. And then they have an esophagus, and the esophagus mostly transports food particles down to the crop. And the crop stores food particles. Keep in mind, earthworms basically crawl through the ground with their mouth open. So they're ingesting lots of food particles, but also lots of dirt particles. And the dirt particles aren't stored in the crop very long. They pass down, they go through the gizzard. Earthworms don't have teeth, but since they swallow some soil as they're eating, they do have small grains of sand in their gizzard. And the gizzard has a lot of muscles in it. So what the gizzard does is the gizzard contracts, and when it contracts, these grains of sand rub together. And as they rub together, that tears the food apart into smaller pieces. Some of you might have eaten chicken gizzards. Chickens don't have teeth either. Birds don't have teeth. And so what chickens do is they swallow small pieces of gravel, small rocks. And then again, their gizzard is very muscular. They contract the muscles and they use those rocks to grind their food up into smaller pieces. Then as the food particles pass down through the intestine, they're digested. And as they're digested, proteins are broken down to amino acids, polysaccharides into monosaccharides, triglycerides into monoglycerides and fatty acids. And then those simple nutrients can be absorbed into the body. So when we look at annelids, they have a complete digestive system. They have a closed circulatory system. They do have segments, and there are some advantages for animals that have segments, in the sense that the segments can basically be built from the same plant. And just a few tweaks can change an esophagus into a crop, into a gizzard. Now, when we say a few tweaks, keep in mind, we're talking about a few genetic tweaks. And we'll talk about development in animals a little bit later, but one of the things that cells in an animal embryo have to know is where they're located in the body. If we look at people, for instance, the genetics of arms and legs are basically the same. But arms don't look the same as legs, because the cells that form the arms know where they are, and the cells that form the legs know where they are. So keep in mind, when we look at annelids, they live in all sorts of environments. They live in aquatic and terrestrial environments. Terrestrial is land, aquatic is water. In aquatic environments, they live in marine environments, saltwater. They live in freshwater environments. And we mentioned some are ectoparasites. Several of the annelids are important for economic reasons. Sometimes those economic reasons overlap with medical reasons. Earthworms increase soil fertility tremendously, really in two ways. They aerate the soil. They create little air pockets as they crawl through. And this can be good because when we look at root cells in a plant, those root cells may need to carry out aerobic cell respiration. Some of the other microorganisms in the soil may need it too. So for aerobic cell respiration, obviously you need oxygen. And they also leave their droppings behind. and their droppings have passed through their body. It consists of things that they can't digest, but it doesn't mean that those things don't enrich the soil. And there are actually people that have earthworm farms or ranches. I'm not sure which term is correct. Now, medically, the group that's been most important historically is the leeches. Many of you may know, but in the Middle Ages, it was believed that the body was composed of different types of humors. Humor is another way of saying fluid. And if you were sick, it was usually believed because you had bad humors in you. So in the Middle Ages, one of the ways that patients were commonly treated was leeches were put on the patient to suck out the bad humors. Now, the problem is at that point, we didn't understand enough about medicine. So if we put a few leeches on you and it didn't seem to work, what did we do? We put a few more leeches on you. And if that didn't seem to work, we put a few more on you. And not too surprisingly, a lot of patients didn't survive treatment with leeches. Now, since leeches normally suck blood, think about what happens when you start bleeding. Normally, if you start bleeding, if you have a small cut, your blood forms a scab and you stop bleeding. Well, that wouldn't work very well if you were a leech. So leeches produce a chemical that stops your blood from coagulating, which is what forms the scab, so that the blood continues to flow. So leeches have actually been used in modern medicine for a couple of different purposes. They're sometimes used if, for instance, you have some damage to your hand and the circulation in your hand is very bad. If we put some leeches on your hand and we control it, since they suck the blood, since they stop the blood from coagulating, they can sometimes improve circulation in an area. Now, the bad thing is, like everything else, if you go online and you search for leech treatments, you can find that leeches are used to relieve all sorts of different medical conditions now. And there's not much evidence that they really work for most of those medical conditions. So unfortunately, they're used for a lot of things that they may or not be effective for. So we said the annelids are very closely related to the mollusca. And the mollusca have the second largest number of species of any of the groups of invertebrates. The only phylum with more species is the Arthropoda. Mollusca means soft body, but a lot of mollusks have a hard shell that covers their soft body. Notice that mollusks is often spelled with a K instead of a C. And when we look at mollusks, mollusks have several different characteristics. They have a nervous system with 2 longitudinal nerve cords. Now, when I say a longitudinal nerve cord, this is a nerve cord that runs the length of their body. So it's kind of like the spinal cord in a person. But notice that mollusks have bilateral symmetry. So when we look at mollusks, they have one of these nerve cords on the right, one on the left. They have a muscular foot that's modified differently in each class. We'll talk about the foot in a few moments with some of the groups. They have a visceral mass containing all their organ systems. And this visceral mass isn't sometimes considered to be a particular characteristic. So that's why after I said 3 characteristics, I have 4 things listed. And they have a thick fold of tissue called the mantle. And this covers up all the visceral mass, and it encloses a coelom, a body cavity. And because it's kind of a broad sheet, it's used in gas exchange and excretion to eliminate waste. And in a lot of mollusks, not all mollusks, but in a lot of mollusks, the mantle secretes a shell. And the shell is typically made of 2 or 3 different chemicals, depending on which type of mollusk we're talking about. Sometimes it's made of chitin, Now, remember a little while ago, we talked about the fact that fungi have a cell wall made of chitin. So here's an example of how the same chemical is used in nature for different purposes. It consists of a protein called conchiolin and calcium carbonate. And we've seen a bunch of things so far that have calcium carbonate shells. Now, because a lot of them have hard shells, mollusks tend to have a very good fossil record compared to some of the groups like roundworms or flatworms that are much softer. There are a lot of people who have studied either snails or clams or oysters or mussels in the fossil record. When we look at mollusks, they live in aquatic and terrestrial habitats. We don't really see very many that are parasitic. They have something called a trochophore larva. And remember what I said, this is similar to the larva stage of some of the annelids. Now, there are 9 different classes of mollusks, and 3 of them are especially important. One is the gastropoda. Remember, we said a moment ago that one of the organs, one of the characteristics of mollusks is that they have a foot that's modified differently. Well, poda, like a podiatrist, means foot. So in the gastropoda, gastro means stomach, the foot is modified into a feeding organ. So the feeding organ is down here. Gastropoda include 2 main groups, snails and slugs. And so if we look at snails or slugs, slugs are basically just a snail without a shell. If we look at snails and slugs, what we see is they crawl over some substrate, and then this radula here has a rough edge. And what they do is they crawl over the substrate, they scrape off their food, and then the food passes into their digestive system. Now, when we look at snails and slugs, they are eaten. Some of you may have had escargot. That's a delicacy, and it's actually snails. Besides that, they can be important economically because they often create havoc by feeding on agricultural plants. Now, another group of mollusks is the class Cephalopoda. Cephala means head, and in the Cephalopoda, the head is modified into, the foot is modified into a head. Here's one you may have trouble seeing unless you download the notes, but this is actually an octopus. You can see one of its eyes here. What you may not realize is that most octopods have very good camouflage abilities. They can blend in with their environment quite well. And even though in movies, octopods are often shown as kind of scary, in reality, they're pretty shy organisms. They have an internal skeleton made of cartilage. And in some ways, it's similar to what we see in vertebrates. There is one group of vertebrates, well, 2, that have skeletons made of cartilage instead of bone. Cephalopods have a particularly well-developed nervous system. And because of this, if we go back, really probably from about the mid-40s to the mid-70s, they were used for a lot of studies of the nervous system. We don't use them so much anymore because we have more sophisticated ways of studying how nerve cells and nervous systems work. But at that time, we couldn't do that very easily. So if we look at squid are in the same group with octopods. Squid have what are called giant squid axons. Most cells in your body are so small, they're difficult to work with. Giant squid axons get their name because they're big cells, not because they necessarily come from a big squid. And they were used in a lot of early experiments because they're so big, you can inject chemicals directly into the cells. Or you can put electrodes into the cytoplasm of the cells and you can run some voltage in the cells. Now you might wonder why we would want to do this, but when nerve cells communicate with each other, the type of signal they use is sometimes described as being an electrochemical signal. So if we change the electrical properties of a nerve cell, or if we inject or remove certain chemicals, we can change the functioning of the nerve cell. And a lot of what we learned initially came from studying these giant squid cells. Octopods have also been used in studies on the nervous system, mostly studies on short and long-term memory. And the reason that this has been done is octopods, octo means 8, so they have 8 arms. And at the base of each arm, where it connects to the main part of the body, they have a ganglion of nerve cells that controls that arm. Kind of like we are pretty sure that some of the dinosaurs had ganglion of nerve cells at different parts in their body just because they were big. But in the central part, in the head, they have what we refer to as a brain, a bigger cluster of nerve cells. Well, when an octopus learns to do something, that information is stored in the ganglion at the base of that particular arm. So maybe it learns to do something with arm number 1. After a while, if the octopus has time to reflect on this, however an octopus reflects, that knowledge gets transferred to the brain. And once it gets transferred to the brain, now if you do the same test with any of the other arms, they can learn the same task faster. But if we don't allow this information to get transferred from the ganglion of nerve cells at the arm to the brain, then each arm has to learn to do the same thing without any help, without any prior knowledge. It takes longer to learn the same thing. Now you might wonder what octopods can do, but they can learn to press levers. They can learn to push doors open. So they can actually be trained to go through pretty sophisticated mazes. The other thing that octopods have been studied for is they have something called a camera eye. And their camera eye actually produces images very similarly to the way that the vertebrate eye, including the human eye, works. It has different parts, but the way that they function is almost identical. So the eye was studied quite a bit in early studies of how the eye works, because, you know, we obviously can do some types of surgery on an octopod that we can't necessarily do on a person. Now, the other reason that this group has been studied is these are the largest invertebrates that we know of. There are some squid that get up to 13 meters long. Some of their relatives seem to get up to 20 meters long, which is 65 or 66 feet long. That's not real well documented at this point, but we do have squid that are at least 40 or 50 feet long that have been observed in the ocean. Some people believe that these large squid are what gave rise to the Norse legends about sea serpents. It's unclear if that's true, but we do know that these are the largest invertebrates. Now, a third class of mollusks that's important is the bivalvia. And bi, of course, means 2. Bivalvia, whoops, that should be an I in there, have 2 valves. Valve is another name for shell. And this includes things like clams, oysters, mussels. And if we look at these organisms, like a lot of things that we see in the animal kingdom, These are sessile filter feeders. They stay in one spot, they pump water through their body, they filter food out of that, and then they pump the water back out of their body. So they have an in-current siphon, and the siphon has muscles in the surrounding tissue. They pump water in. The water is filtered out. They exchange gases. They have gills. And then the water is pumped back out through the excurrent siphon. Now, notice that they do have two adductor muscles. And adductor muscles pull the two halves of the shell together. When these muscles relax, the shell opens up. So even if you look at a small clam or an oyster, the muscles on that small clam or oyster are actually so strong, people can't open the shells up. They can resist that for several hours. Well, we'll talk in a minute how you might do that. Now, this group is important because a lot of us do eat them as food, and they're also used to produce pearls. Most pearls now are produced commercially, but if we go back further than the middle 1900s, Illinois was actually one of the leading producers of freshwater pearls, because we have a lot of mussels growing in streams and lakes in Illinois, and these mussels can produce pearls. We might think of pearls as only coming from oysters, but that's not the only place where they come from. Now, today, how do we produce them commercially? You know, the problem with going out to a stream or going out to a lake and picking up mussels or clams or oysters and trying to find a pearl is they don't produce pearls normally. They produce pearls when a grain of sand or a little piece of grit slips into the clam or oyster or mussel. How does it slip in? Well, every once in a while, they open their shells slightly. So if a little piece of grit slips in and it gets between the mussel and the shell, this is an irritation. It's kind of like having something in your sock where it's rubbing on your foot. So how does the clam handle this irritation? It starts building layers of pearl around the irritation. So the problem is finding a pearl in a mussel that's living in an Illinois lake is kind of iffy. Probably going to have to open a lot of mussels to find a pearl. However, if you can somehow make sure that they get an irritant in them, then almost every mussel would produce a pearl. So there are actually some places that farm oysters and clams and mussels, mostly oysters, to grow pearls because the ones that come out of oysters tend to look a little bit nicer. And what you do is you take the oyster out of the water, you anesthetize it, and when you anesthetize it, just like a person, the muscles relax. So the muscles relax, and now you can open up the shell, and then you put an irritant, or sometimes 2 or 3 irritants, spaced around the mantle at different locations. And you put those irritants in, you close the shell back up, and you put the oyster back in the water. You have to do this all pretty quickly because since oysters have gills, they breathe water. They don't really breathe air very well. So the oyster can suffocate if you take too long to do this. So there are actually people who do this for a living. They work at these farms and they take the oysters, they anesthetize them, put the irritant in, put them back in the water. Now notice that the oysters at these farms are grown in big kind of swimming pools, or sometimes they're grown in the ocean, but they're grown on boards that are put into the ocean and then attached to ropes and buoys, and they're brought up every once in a while to check for pearls. So when we look at these organisms, turns out that Illinois used to be, emphasis on used to be, a big pearl producer. Now, it turns out Illinois still has a role in the pearl industry because the irritant that they use is mostly fragments of mussel shell. And since there are a lot of mussels in Illinois lakes and rivers, a lot of mussels from Illinois are sold to places in Japan and other areas where there are oyster farms, and the shells are ground up to use as irritants to put into oysters. Are there any questions about annelids or mollusks before we leave these two groups? Okay, I'm going to stop screen sharing for a moment, and we're going to go to some of our other groups of arthropods, some of our other groups of invertebrates, and we're going to start out by focusing on arthropods. Now, there are more arthropod species than any other group of organisms. In fact, there's about as many arthropods as there are all the other groups combined. Now, part of this is because a lot of arthropods are important in terms of transmitting disease or causing agricultural problems. But we do think that, excuse me, there are probably more arthropods than all other groups combined. Right now, about 3 million species have been studied and classified. Over 1 million of them are arthropods. So let's look at some of their characteristics. If we look at arthropods, they do have a segmented body. But as opposed to the segmented worms, the segments are grouped into 3 different sections. There's a head and a thorax and an abdomen. And what we see is that arthropods have appendages on each segment. And the appendages on different segments are specialized to do different types of functions. So appendages include things like legs, swimmerets, which are found on some things like crawdads, wings, antennae, you might think of them as being sensory organs, ovipositors, which are the organs that females use to lay eggs. And there are some other types as well. This is just the most common ones. Some of the segments have actually lost their appendages over evolutionary time. So we don't see an appendage on every segment. Now, there are several different classes of arthropods, and we're going to talk about some of the most common ones. Remember, when we began our discussion of animals, one of the things that we said was, yeah, there are about maybe 35 different phyla, but almost all the animals that you see in any environment belong to 9 phyla. And probably in any environment you go, you would see some arthropods. So one of the classes of arthropods is the class Crustacea. So this is crabs, lobsters, shrimp, crayfish, something called sow bugs, which are also called pill bugs or roly-poly bugs, water fleas, if you've ever heard of them, barnacles. Most of these organisms, not all, but most of these organisms live in aquatic environments. And there's so many of them, they're sometimes referred to as insects of the sea. When we look at these organisms, notice that when they live in water, other than the barnacles, well, barnacles do have legs, but they're sedentary. But if we look at the other organisms, if we look at lobsters and crabs, lobsters and crabs live on the bottom of the ocean floor. So, like a lot of other organisms, even though we kind of consider lobster a delicacy, and people will pay pretty good money to eat lobster or crab at a restaurant, lobsters and crabs do kill some of their prey, but they're also detrivores. Detrivores means they eat junk. since they live on the bottom of the ocean, what junk do they eat? Dead things that drift to the bottom of the ocean. So they don't sound quite so delicate when we describe them that way. Now, one of the classes of arthropods that almost everybody has heard of is a class called the arachnida. Thanks to a movie called Arachnophobia, people have heard of arachnids, even if they didn't know them before. Now, besides spiders, this includes scorpions, it includes ticks, and it includes mites. Notice that ticks and mites are both ectoparasites. They live on the outside of their host. If we look at arachnids, they have 4 pairs of walking legs. And then they have 2 pairs of modified appendages on their head that are used for feeding. But spiders don't have antennae and they don't have wings. Now, similar to something that we see with other groups of arthropods, the head and the thorax sections, remember we said a few minutes ago, arthropods have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. In spiders, the head and thorax are fused into something called a cephalothorax. Remember with the cephalopoda, we said cephala means head. Not all, but most spiders have spinnerets, which is another type of appendage. And they use the spinneret to make the silk for their web. And notice not all silk is sticky. If you look at the typical spider web, one reason that spiders can walk on it and not get tangled up is because they know which threads are sticky and which threads aren't. It's usually the threads that radiate out from the middle that aren't sticky. All spiders are poisonous. And most spiders, when they feed, they're somewhat of an exception to the rule that when we talk about nutrition in animals, we say that animals are heterotrophic by ingestion. They eat their food. If when the weather gets nice, you find a spider web and you want to be daring, check the flies that you can see trapped in the spider web. And if you check the flies, what you'll see is they kind of fall into 2 or 3 different categories. There are some flies that have just been caught that you can see them still moving. They're tangled up in the web, and the more they move, typically, the more they get tangled up. There are some spiders that are some flies, sorry, that are laying still. But if you feel them, if you palpate them very gently, they're solid. And there are some flies that if you feel them, their body is full of liquid. And if you're not very careful, when you feel them, you'll squish them and the liquid will just spill out. This is because not only do spiders inject poison into their prey, they inject their digestive enzymes into their prey. So when a spider gets trapped in the web, when a fly gets trapped in the web, the spider injects the poison to kill it. The spider injects the enzymes. And remember that insects have a hard outer skeleton. And so the spider's enzymes basically liquefy the insect inside its hard outer skeleton. And then the spider comes back later and sucks out all the juices. But, you know, this is kind of similar to what we see with fungi. Fungi are heterotrophic by absorption. Fungi release their enzymes onto their environment, liquefy it, and then absorb the nutrients. Spiders kind of do the same. Now, notice that the 2 North American spiders who are the most poisonous, or at least I should say kill the most people, are 2 types called the brown recluse spider and the black widow spider. The brown recluse spider is sometimes also called the violin spider because it has a mark on its abdomen that vaguely looks like a violin, I guess. Notice that the spider that you sometimes see in movies that's used to scare people, tarantulas, are not all that poisonous. They're big and hairy, so they look kind of scary. But actually tarantulas are not that poisonous. And for spider bites in general, most people who are bitten by them survive. Does anybody know which spider in North America is the most poisonous? Now, I said it wasn't really brown recluse or black widow, even though these are the type of spiders that if people have to go to a hospital, it's for a bite from one of these two. In North America, the spider whose bite is actually most poisonous is a spider you might have seen called a daddy longlegs. And the poison they contain is very serious. However, if you see a daddy longlegs, you really don't have to worry for one simple reason. Guess what? Their mouth is so small, they can't bite a person on any part of your skin. Even if you look at the flap of skin between your fingers, their mouth is so small, they can't bite you in that flap. So they don't really cause any problems, even though they're very poisonous. Now, although tarantulas aren't very poisonous, scorpions are very poisonous. Scorpions are much more poisonous than tarantulas. And you don't have to go very far. If you go down to southern Missouri, anywhere past about the central part of the state, you can find tarantulas, and you can also find scorpions. So we might think of those types of animals as only being found in deserts, but that's not the case. Another group of arthropods is the chilopoda. And chilopoda are commonly called the centipedes. Cent means 100, but centipedes don't have 100 legs. If you look at a centipede, what they have is they have one pair of appendages on every segment. Now, all centipedes are carnivorous, and some people actually go into anaphylactic shock if they get bitten by a centipede, similar to the way that some people go into anaphylactic shock if they get stung by a bee. If you have centipedes in your house, this is the most common centipede. This is magnified. It's not usually this big, but it's called the northern eastern centipede. And it's kind of a reddish color, kind of a maroon, not a bright red. And since they're carnivorous, if you have centipedes in your house, and keep in mind, they're not going to attack you. So you don't have to worry about getting bit by one, but it probably means you have flies or cockroaches or something else because they're carnivorous. So they're feeding on something else, not you. Are there any questions about these first couple of groups of arthropods? We haven't gotten through them all yet, but we're about done. So I think we're going to have to quit for today.
Professor, what about millipedes?
That's the next group we're going to get to. We just haven't gotten there first.
I thought they were together out with the centipede, like, because they look similar.
You might think they're in the same group, but they're actually different enough. They're put in a completely separate class. Any other questions? Okay, if there are no more questions, I'll let you go. Don't forget about the bacteria and virus questions. And it sounds like you're just going to have to email that to me as an attachment. So I'll see if I can figure out what I did wrong so that I can correct that for the next assignment, but I don't want to cause problems with this assignment by changing some of the settings after people have started turning it in. So if you don't have any questions, I will let you go.